Ukraine may have turned tide of Russian territorial gains, says think tank. ISW says Moscow's advance is slowing as Ukraine claims more than 35,000 Russian soldiers were killed or seriously wounded in April. After slowing Russia's rate of advance over the past several months, Ukraine may have tipped the scales in April and recaptured more of its land than it lost, according to an analysis of battlefield positions. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, said it had observed evidence that Russian forces suffered a net loss of 116 square kilometers, 45 square miles during the month. That figure counted only territory firmly held by each side, not what it called gray zones, where both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers held positions. Russian forces have been using infiltration tactics in part to create the perception of continuous Russian advances across the front and to support Kremlin cognitive warfare efforts to exaggerate Russian successes, the ISW said. Russian forces, however, do not control these infiltration areas. The ISW has observed a progressive slowing of the Russian rate of advance by at least two-thirds over the past 18 months. It found that Russian forces seized an average of 2.9 sq/km, 1.1 sq miles a day, in the first third of 2026, compared with an average of 9.76 sq/km, 3.77 sq miles in the same period in 2025. Russian President Vladimir Putin has prioritized capturing the remainder of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, which contains a fortress belt of heavily fortified cities, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, and Drushkivka. Russian assaults here noticeably increased in April, said Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi. Advertisement Moscow has claimed to be gradually overrunning Konstantinivka, but the ISW observed that it had infiltrated in 10.14% of Konstantinivka and advanced in only 0.7% of its eastern outskirts. Ukraine also said Russia suffered higher casualties than its rate of recruitment could replenish for the fifth month running. In April, 35,203 Russian soldiers were eliminated or seriously wounded, said Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, adding that Russia was gradually drowning in losses. In March, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukrainian intelligence had obtained Russian documents reporting that 62% of casualties were deaths, a higher rate than Ukraine or anyone else had previously assumed. It is not clear when Ukrainian forces reached that level of lethality, but it seems to be a recent development. Fedorov said on May 6 that last year Russia was losing about 14,000 soldiers per month, meaning deaths, since total casualties averaged 34,833. That would suggest recent advances in Ukrainian tactics. Zelensky recently said Ukraine aimed to double down on mid-range attacks in the Russian rear, striking supplies before they can be brought to bear on the battlefield. In April, the number of strikes over 20 km 12 miles was twice as high as in March and 4 times as high as in February, said Fedorov. The revenue war Ukraine struck several refineries and oil facilities during the past week as part of a strategy of depriving Russia of export revenue. It struck the Tuapse refinery on the Black Sea for the fourth time in 2 weeks on May 1, and the Perm refinery 1,000 km, 620 miles inside Russia on the same night. On May 2, Ukraine used surface drones to raid 2 Russian oil tankers outside the offloading port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. On the same night, Zelensky said the Ukraine Security Service SBU struck a missile carrier, a patrol boat, and a tanker in the port of Primorsk in the Baltic Sea, also damaging the oil terminal. On May 5, Ukraine struck the Kirishynfjord Syntez in the Leningrad region. The Reuters news agency reported that the refinery stopped operations after 3 of its 4 distillation towers were damaged. Ukraine has also targeted military equipment. Zelensky said Flamingo drones had covered a distance of 1,500 km, 930 miles, to strike a manufacturer of navigation modules for the Russian Navy, Air Force, and rocket forces in Cheboksary on May 5. Ukraine also recently struck several Su-57 fighter jets and Su-34 bombers at the Shabel airfield in Chelyabinsk, more than 1,600 km, 994 miles inside Russia. advertisement. Russia and Ukraine have given conflicting reports on the damage to Russian oil revenues. By the most conservative estimates, the aggressor state has lost at least $7 billion since the beginning of the year solely from our effective sanctions against the Russian oil industry and refining, from hits, downtime, and delays in shipments, Zelensky said on May 1. Bloomberg reported on April 30 that average output per refinery had dropped to 4.69 million barrels a day, the lowest since 2009. But Russia had a different assessment, wrote the independent Russian outlet Meduza. The Ministry of Finance on May 6 said mineral extraction revenues doubled to $12 billion in April relative to March. Of this, $10 billion was from oil, whose price has soared during the U.S.-Israel war on Iran. Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov recently told a Kremlin reporter he expected May oil revenues to be $2.7 billion higher. Fedorov also raised the alarm, saying Russia's windfall from high oil prices was estimated at $150 m a day and could amount to $40 billion in 2026. It was unclear whether Zelensky's $7 billion figure was an estimate of revenue deprivations over and above that windfall. Meduza wrote that Moscow would spend half of April's oil revenue subsidizing oil companies to keep gasoline prices low and to modernize and repair oil refineries, suggesting Ukraine was still taking a toll. Diplomacy triumphs. Ukraine has faced opposition to its European Union funding and membership bid from EU members Hungary and Slovakia, but in the past week, its relationship with both countries improved. Zelensky said on May 2 he had invited Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico to visit Kiev and had received an invitation to Bratislava. Fico had vetoed Ukrainian talks to join the EU in June 2025, but relented in September for reasons he never explained. Hungary's former Prime Minister Viktor Orban had also vetoed those talks, and his successor, Peter Magyar, has not yet lifted that veto, saying he will hold a referendum on the matter. In the meantime, Magyar returned to Ukraine's Oshad Bank $82 m in cash and valuables Orban had seized in March on suspicion that the 7 Ukrainians carrying it were money laundering. Zelensky hailed it as a constructive and civilized step, but unblocking Ukraine's accession may be easier said than done. A poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations (ECFR) found that 54% of Hungarians still oppose the move. Majorities also continue to oppose Hungary's participation in EU financial aid to Kiev, as they continue to oppose the shipment of weapons to Ukraine via Hungary. Hungarian voters might be underestimating how important opening Ukraine's accession negotiations are for Hungary's European partners, the ECFR said, or they are simply not linking it to Hungary normalizing its relations with Brussels.